Our last person is Gemma Huldi, a writer, advisor, and facilitator on cultivating healthy and inclusive working practices in the aid and development sector. She has worked on humanitarian and human rights programs in East Africa and the Middle East, and in 2019 completed her PhD in international development at the University of Sussex, which investigated stress and burnout among international and national aid workers in Kenya. In September 2021, her new book, The Vulnerable Humanitarian: Ending Burnout Culture in the Aid Sector, will be published by Routledge, and you can read more about her work on her website. So welcome, everybody. I'm so excited to have you guys here. Unfortunately, the recording started late, so we've missed a couple introductions. My apologies. But I'm so happy to have you guys here. I'm going to close my window because that's okay. And so I will go ahead and ask our first question. So what are the structural issues that contribute to collective trauma and ill health in the humanitarian sector? So whoever wants to start.
Is this where everyone looks at each other and goes, no, you, no, you, no, you?
I'm happy to go first. So I can obviously speak from like a grassroots perspective. So we work with a lot of organizations in the grassroots space in Europe, and I think one of the main structural issues for us as a whole sector is that we are mainly reliant on volunteers. We're basically a movement led by volunteers who are, standing in solidarity with people on the move. The default through that is that we just have a general lack of resources, meaning, we're dependent on people who are relatively not specifically low skilled, but maybe don't have enough experience within the field, but we are relying on their skills that they can bring to the table. In terms of lack of resources for us, it's also hugely impacting the way that we can support volunteers in terms of psychological support. There is very little vetting that happens before people come out and volunteer and offer their services. There's very little training that happens beforehand as well. So these are the main two pillars that we usually identify as real contributors to leading to burnout, because people don't really have the right skills and tools to be able to stay resilient within a very, very emotionally challenging setting. And I guess that's what we are trying to do with the wellbeing pilot, is really addressing both of these things, making sure that volunteers are going to the right places based on their skills, but then also making sure that volunteers have the adequate training, also that they know what they're getting themselves into, because oftentimes it's a lot of young people who, want to do their bit of activism and channel that through volunteering in that space, and just making sure that people have the sufficient information beforehand.
Great, thank you, Sophie. Does anyone else have any thoughts? And what are the structural issues that contribute to the collective trauma and ill health in the humanitarian sector?
I ended up actually writing down a few things here. I'll start off with a couple, maybe just throw in a few later as well. Don't want to take up too much time, but there are a whole heap of structural issues. One sort of fundamental one I can understand is the funding model from donors. There's always an emphasis on the impact of a program and a project, and often those deliverables don't take into account how people will be in delivering those particular projects. They're very much to do with sort of structural indicators, operational indicators, that sort of thing, outputs, outcomes. One of the things that I know that I've been sort of pushing for when I was working sort of in a sort of operational capacity was, as you're working with donors, to actually say, well, okay, you've got sort of funding set aside for the admin side of things, the overheads. You've got certain funding set aside potentially sometimes for security, but for having a specific line would have, I think, profound implications into changing the mindset. Because if the purpose of, for example, DFID or a government funder wanting to make a huge impact with the funds that they've got, taxpayer money, then having a budget line on the well-being of staff would actually make a huge difference, because the impact that you're trying to make with the project will be much better if people aren't burned out or stressed out, or ending up being so completely run ragged at the end of a program that when it comes to the next funding that they apply for, that they're going into it with so much depleted already. And so I think it would also, it's throwing down the gauntlet, saying, okay, here's a funding line, whatever it may be, 3%, 5% of the actual program funds that we might give you as a donor. It would actually create a behavior change within agencies, I think, to really mainstream well-being, not just to do it as a tick box exercise, or just do it as if anything happens, we'll send you off to the employee assistance programs, but actually seeing how you can actually build in well-being practices within the organization and have accountability for those well-being practices. So when you have these sort of CAP surveys and knowledge attitudes practices, are looked at in more detail, you can actually hold accountable, are you looking after your staff in the process of delivering the deliverables for your project as well? So I think that's one particular aspect that could be done as a very tangible way of seeding well-being in the system as a structural aspect. And the second, I've got a few things, but I'll stick to just the second one here. I wrote down this idea of having just looking at well-being for your own colleagues and personnel within your own organizations. But is there a way of getting another view externally that all agencies can assign to, whether it's some sort of agreed system that we all follow a particular protocol or process that is globally recognized to support our staff? Because otherwise what tends to happen is those agencies that can afford it, or who are large enough to actually invest in well-being, they will be the ones that benefit. And as we move more and more to localization of humanitarian aid work, it's often those first responders from small organizations at a local level who don't have the funds, they don't have those particular resources. But if you have an organization outside small individual organizations who could actually broker support, who can actually provide training, for example, in a collective fashion, that could work very well. And this links to some of the work that I did in the Philippines, and a wonderful group effort of agencies setting up a wellbeing cluster, where there was a burden sharing approach. So a larger agency would be able to share and offer some of its services, which could be utilized by the smaller agencies, and likewise. So it was a way of actually leveling the playing field and everyone having access to good practices as well. So having some sort of meta organization, a meta approach, not just an individualized approach, would, I guess, hopefully level the playing field and stop maybe a sort of hierarchical aspect of well-being only being afforded by the larger wealthy organization, for example.
Those are some really great solutions to some of the problems. How would you communicate or identify the structural issues that you're addressing through those potential solutions?
So if you rephrase the question, what would that be? So how would I approach the...
So you gave us some really great solutions to some of the problems. Can you clarify what exactly the problems are that you're addressing with those potential solutions? Why that burnout happens?
Though that would be a much more deeper conversation, I think. But we all know about the sort of vicarious trauma from just going in, one mission after another mission, dealing with not only just the regular sort of issues that you might find in a development context, some of the the ongoing aspects of poverty, for example, and suffering that you might see. But also then in the humanitarian sector, you might have critical incidents, you might have conflict situations, tsunamis, you've got the immediacy of suffering of humanity because of something that's happened drastically. To sort of address the question, I believe, if I understand it correctly, is whether it's a development context or a humanitarian context. One of the structures that was developed in the Philippines, again, the wellbeing cluster, which was actually part of the DFID-funded project that I was leading on. The wellbeing cluster was designed in a way that agencies, faith-based groups, local government bodies, psychology departments, universities would get together and they'd pool their resources, they'd pool their talent together. And before emergency, they would actually provide training. There would be a skilling up and a preparation aspect and planning aspect. During an emergency, a lot of those structures, because there's been coordination beforehand, they could be activated to actually support people on the ground during the time. And then post-emergencies, there'd be a collective learning to put back into the cycle again, so that again, you're planning, you're delivering, and you're reflecting and improving for the next time around. And because you had such a diverse range of expertise, and you had local agencies who were operating on peanuts at a very local level, and you had international NGOs, for example, everyone coming together and forming this wellbeing cluster, they were able to negotiate, the trainings which they would not be able to afford anywhere else because everyone is actually burden sharing. So it was cost effective in that way. But what was more important was that because this was all localized and contextually it needs to be localized, this is a pilot for a new type of humanitarian architecture, perhaps, and a new model for well-being. It meant that the well-being approaches were very specific to that local culture, the language, the context as well. And there was a two-way learning process. It wasn't just a sort of very colonial attitude of, we're doing mental health and we're going to use a lot of the Western models, into a culture that might not fully appreciate that. But it meant that there could be a real dialogue between the smaller organizations, the academia, so you're doing no harm, that you had sort of faith-based groups as well that could add another context to it as well. So it was very much enriching and providing for the needs of the local community, and providing resources as well in that collective way. So the wellbeing cluster works, and it's still very strong as well, which is great after 3 years. So I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, I think to some degree. I think what I'm hearing is that some of the larger problems you're addressing is the lack of ability to pay for well-being services, or to focus on that, and that creating that collective shared burden sharing, as you were saying, actually allows people to share the burden financially, intellectually, and then time-wise, so that they can all benefit from that. Thank you.
That's right. Thank you.
Ria and Gemma, what do you feel like are some of the structural issues that contribute to the collective trauma and ill health in the humanitarian sector?
I'll go next. And I'm really excited to hear what Gemma has to say also. I mean, I want to caveat also my presence here. I work as a lawyer, I work as a consultant in the humanitarian sector, but I come from working in the human rights public interest space in India, and then as a consultant in the humanitarian sector in different places. So I have a slightly I'm more sort of based in movement spaces here in India. And then, of course, the study that I, worked on with a much larger team, of course, and did some of the interviews for, was to understand, in different human rights organizations, what are the kinds of, what is a sense of what the well-being kind of challenges that the organizations are facing, and then what are the kinds of things that they're doing. It's almost like mapping it. And I was really happy to speak to Gemma actually during that study too. But I mean, so there's one thing that I've noticed is common, across the human rights and the humanitarian field, which is one is this kind of savior complex kind of way of being, and this is it's not a radical thing to say, we've known about this, but it's still there. There's like in an Indian context, it's like a caste class based kind of savior complex. In a different context, it can be a colonial kind of savior but that just, I think it does a disservice both to the person who is feeling like that, like, okay, the burden is on me to go and fix all of these things. It does a disservice to the quality of the work, because it's sort of like, well, I'm here to fix these problems. And I know, like, the humanitarian field is aware of this, has been trying to fix it for a long time, but I think it really does have an impact on mental health, on well-being, on that, how well you feel while doing this work. The second thing is really like also this, how productivity is conceptualized, like there is this sense of like, as a lawyer, like somebody who I'd interviewed more recently said, there's this pressure to always appear to be the busiest person in the room, and I think that like, I think that's also another common thread running across, the humanitarian and the human rights kind of spaces that I've worked in. So those are the two kinds of things that I will name. And of course, like, I think conditions of work, the sense of financial insecurity is definitely like a major factor in how people who are working in this sector experience their work. And yeah, I mean, I have no thoughts, but I'm really excited to hear about what Gemma has to say. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Ria. Thanks for sharing that. And it's really nice to hear this perspective from India specifically too, kind of broadening our horizons a little bit. And I think that the humanitarian sector and the development sector have a lot of overlap in the work that they do. And so that's really nice to have your perspective. Gemma, so you're last. Let's hear what you have to say.
Thank you. If I can live up to your expectations, Ria. Yeah, I mean, I guess I can come at this from my own experience working in the sector, but also from the research that I did, which was in Kenya, working with national and international staff there. And I think Ria was touching on it, the sort of the saviour complex, certainly the white saviour complex, it's a phrase we hear a lot, but also this general push for kind of perfectionism and heroism within the sector, the fact that we expect so much of ourselves and to keep on pushing through despite the exposure to immense suffering that we're often faced with every single day through the work that we do. So having to kind of man up a bit, and that is often the kind of organisational culture that aid workers, development workers find themselves in. There's no space to process what's happening and how they feel. And sometimes let's not forget, some staff may be coming to the field, may be coming to this work with trauma already from their own background, from their own histories, from something else, and they might be bringing that into the workspace, and there's no opportunity to talk about it. And as I said, there's often this feeling that to do so is self-indulgent in some way, and I've certainly seen that in my own work experience. Having to as I say, be exposed to a lot of traumatizing situations and people who've been victims of human rights violations, of abuses, in conflict settings, those sorts of things. And then coming back into my office and just having to write the report or, report to the donors or develop an advocacy campaign, whatever it is, but there's no space for the individual to really address what's going on for them. And I think everyone feeds into that culture as well. In addition to that, there is, as already I think all of you have touched upon, there is limited support available. Yes, there might well be a counselling service. That's not necessarily the answer for everyone. Not everyone wants one-to-one counselling, particularly if that counselling is provided by a sort of a service that perhaps doesn't have much experience in international development, or is provided by a service where it's all white people from the global north, and that touches on a different issue as well, is that there is massive diversity in this sector, and yet a lot of the support and privileges of this work, and I'm not denying it's difficult work, but nevertheless, a lot of the support in terms of salaries, in terms of benefits, in terms of allowances, goes to international staff from the global north. So I think we have to remember there are often huge inequalities throughout the system, when actually the majority of the sector, if we're looking at the sort of broader humanitarian development sector, is made up of national staff from the global south. So that is going to be felt as well, that lack of support specifically for some people more than others. And I'm also talking about people of colour who work in offices in the global north as well, in European head offices. And so the system there, and we've heard about it a lot, in particular in the last few years, around racism, around sexual harassment as well, that is going to be a cause of collective trauma, never mind the work that people are doing outside and the kind of trauma that that might be creating. And the fact that there are inequalities in the system and what kind of support you can receive is going to add to the problem.
Thank you for laying that out. You guys all had some really good answers. I have so many questions that I want to ask each of you guys, but I'm going to try to stick to the questions I was given. And if we have extra time, then we can move on. So our next question is, how can the sector, both as a whole and in individual organizations, better support humanitarian wellness? And anyone can kind of jump in and start sharing.
I've just realized when I was writing down my notes that I probably looked at it from the wrong way, the first question a little bit. And just doing a bit of a two-step, just taking one step back before going one step forward again. I think one of the other structural issues, or the mindset issues, I think it seems better that way when I view it that way, is that, and these are changing at the moment, but I know that going back about 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 years ago, there was much more of an emphasis on treatment rather than prevention, in terms of, you know, okay, we'll catch you when you fall. If something happens, then we've got, again, the employee assistance programs, we'll send you off. And I think that was one of the structural issues that is causing a lot of trauma as well, because, you know, there was a little piece that I wrote a while back, and a silly little sort of allegory that we use is that if somebody was training to be a fireman and we said, don't worry, if you get burnt, you know, we'll send you off to hospital to treat you for your burns, as opposed to we'll give you adequate training to understand what a fire is like and the actual safety equipment that you need, you know, the preventatives. And I still think that whilst COVID has sort of helped get a better understanding of mental health issues, and people are now looking at a more preventative approach, I still think it's not as well developed, because often the work that I'm doing in the sector at the moment, when they look at some of the preventative aspects, it tends to be like, can you just do a little bit here, a little bit there, we'll tick a box somewhere maybe in our HR department, and then we'll say that that's been done. And it's not a real well-being ingrained process or a mindset change within an organization. So that was just one thing I just wanted to add for the first question there. So yeah, just a thought, you know, a bit more emphasis on prevention and a real sort of deep meaning there. But coming back to this question now of how can the sector, both as a whole and in individual organizations, better support humanitarian wellness? Again, and sorry, I know I'm sort of touting this sort of wellbeing cluster sort of approach and model. I'm doing so because it was something that was drawn from the back of an envelope, and it seems to be working at the moment, and it's sort of it's in its 4th year of operation at the moment. But again, it is having that locally contextualized approach, the burden sharing approach with multiple actors and players, because ultimately, given the turnover within organizations where people come in for short contracts, and then they go off to another agency, and then they go off to another agency, if if our workers aren't looked upon, as a moving target within the sector as a whole, and they only go through organizations that can support them, it means that, one, they're coming in blind and you don't know what trauma they might already have unless there is a genuine benign vetting process that's actually supportive of them as they come in. But also you might be leaving them when they actually need help once they leave the organization, and then they'll just go another one. And so again, having a meta perspective, that maybe the wellbeing cluster is one approach of having different organizations, or having an organization where aid workers can assign themselves to a set of principles, that there's a way of actually checking to make sure that they're okay, even when they leave one organization, that there's another body that can actually look after them and support them along the way. That's almost supported by the agencies themselves. I think that could be a way of actually supporting wellness in a much better way, both individually within the organization and as a sector as well.
Yeah, it sounds like almost like you're talking about like a hive, like you as a worker enter into this hive, whether it's through one organization or another, and you're a part of that as long as you want to be a part of that, which could be more long-term. And I think a lot of people tend to leave the sector because they're burnt out, not necessarily because they want to leave the sector. And so having that kind of support could be really beneficial.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I can imagine how technically difficult it might be, but I think it's probably the direction of travel, I think, to really support people in the sector, especially local staff, I think.
Yeah, and I think for me, at least, I haven't heard a lot of conversations about supporting the local workers in the humanitarian aid sector as much as I have about the global north workers. So I think that that's appreciated as well. Okay, so anyone else? How can the sector, both as a whole or an individual organization, better support humanitarian wellness?
Well, I think from my experience, whilst I was working in Greece, what I have always noticed is just the sheer lack of communication around mental well-being, and having quite a lot of shame around maybe expressing that you're experiencing a certain level of tiredness, or which is, also normal. Everyone feels tired, but there was just never sort of the willingness to really talk about it and sit down, and everyone was really afraid to say, I might be experiencing signs of burnout, because they were sort of like trapped in this hamster wheel of just, let's just keep going. We're doing this for something else, which is where the savior complex comes in. So I think as a whole, and in terms of individual organizations, so much can be done by just providing a space where, you're able to not always look outwards, but really look inwards, and help humanitarians build a certain level of awareness of their own emotions, so that they can then also communicate that with other people, and maybe recognize these emotions and behaviors in other people as well. Because if you're burnt out, usually you don't know it yourself. You need someone else to give you a bit of a nudge from the side. But I think within my experience within Greece, that is something, there's definitely been like a culture, or there is a real culture of, sort of brushing it under the carpet, and not really making mental well-being a huge priority within organizations. I think when something comes up, well-being usually just drops down the priority list, and I think keeping the conversation going and keeping it on people's minds is the main thing for us there.
Sophie, have you seen any good examples of sort of helping staff workers develop that self-knowing, that self-awareness that you're talking about?
Yeah, we have worked with a few organizations who have provided these listening circles where once a week, you come together and you talk about, just like having a space for reflections where you talk about, what has happened this week, how everyone has been experiencing that. So I guess there's then again challenges within the dynamics of the group that, there's a lot of questions around that, but I would say that's a really good start to make sure that everyone just calms down a minute and isn't just trapped in the hecticness of everything.
Yeah, I like that idea of listening circles, doing it communally and not just individually.
Yeah.
Ria and Gemma, do you guys have an answer?
I'd like to just build on some of what Sophie was saying, actually, because I think you've touched on a really important point, which is, this isn't just about having particular policies in place or a counselling service or something like that. It is about, how people are communicating mental health. And certainly from my experience, certainly in my research, that there might be a counselling service in place, but people aren't using it because people are scared to use it, because they might be judged, it might get reported to HR, and then they might lose their job. And these things do actually happen. So they're not just kind of making this stuff up. So I think, the conversation around mental health needs to become a priority, and it needs to be opened up, and it obviously starts with leadership and management, but it starts with everyone actually as well. And I'm going to plug my book now, but my book recommends, in part 2 of the book, there's 2 areas. One is kind of looking at this leads into your third question, I think, as well, about organizational culture, like how to sort of, what systems need to change where wellness and well-being is integrated into program design, into fundraising, into certainly negotiation with donors, but also into kind of the day-to-day conversation, and it becomes a regular thing. And then there's another part of my book that recommends more practices around self and collective care, which is kind of, what Sophie's touching upon is, how do we have those conversations? How do we create those spaces, listening spaces? I call them brave spaces, because actually brave spaces it's about talking about mental health, but it might also be talking about the racism, for instance, that affects mental health, and that is a brave conversation to be having. So how can we do that more? How can we also have conversations more around getting things wrong? People are so scared to admit that they might have got something wrong. And as a result, we don't learn very much within our organizations about change and about growth, because we don't want to speak up about mistakes or our limitations or our vulnerabilities. So I think, there's a lot there around how do we approach mental health in a way where it's not sort of stigmatized. There is one thing that I often mention in the workshops I deliver on resilience and well-being within the sector, which is the Wellness Action Plan, which is it is it comes from the UK charity called Mind, but it's something that can be used everywhere, and it's a template. It's a kind of way of managers and staff opening up a conversation around the specific things that the staff member finds stressful, what the triggers are, what the impact is on their mental health, what kind of support they might need, but also what self-care they can give themselves. And it's a way of just, systematizing that dialogue, so that you can then sort of keep returning to it and saying, okay, what support do you need? What can we change? How are things improving? How might they be getting worse? And it's co-created, it's led from the staff member, which I would say links to another thing that I think is really important, is that let's remember, again, the diversity of the sector. We cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach. We need to look beyond just a counselling service and look at different people need different things, and that's how we learn about mental health and well-being in the sector, is that we start asking questions and finding out things about what triggers there are, but also what the coping mechanisms are, because they're going to be very, very different according to where people live, according to what access they have to health services, according to their culture, their traditions. So let's perhaps learn more from people from the global south about how they approach wellness and mental health as well.
Yeah, those are some really, really great ideas. I work in emergency medicine and have for the last 10 years. And so it feels like so many of the things that we're talking about are things that are very common in emergency medicine, in the healthcare sector as well. And I think there's a lot that these two sectors can potentially learn from each other as they seek out what is a more wellness preventative approach in the structures and the systems that they create. So, yeah. Ria, do you have an answer as well?
Lots of really brilliant thoughts, and not so much to add on, I feel. I mean, I think like one of the structural things that I didn't, that I want to name also, like to also just to hit Indra's trick and go back one question. But it's this like management and leadership, like not always being trained to actually like care for people. And if you don't have a caring boss, like you know it, you know, they might say, oh, we care about your, you know, well-being, and but you know in your bones, like that doesn't seem right to me, right? And I think it's also how they're treating themselves often, because they're like in that very insane like having to deliver all of these things and having to take care of these people. And then I mean, and that's also like, okay, that's not a very sustainable way of being a person, you know. And I think something really interesting that I saw in an organization, I heard of in an organization, is having say two people co-sharing like a management role or a leadership role. So you can sort of have somebody to kind of, you know, you share the burden, you work together on it. So it's not just that, you know, one person is having to take on a lot of this stuff. And so that's maybe like one kind of practical way that I've seen, you know, an organization actually, you know, address that. To build on you know, Sophie and Gemma's points on the idea of like a listening circle or a brave space. And I really like that term also, brave space. I think it's also like, exactly like you said, like what exactly does diversity mean? And, you know, and it feels so different in each context, you know, because there's like, you know, neurotypical diversity, there's different working styles, there's different grieving styles, you know, and there has to be some understanding of like, okay, there are people who come with all of their own experiences, and you know, there's some that can be attributed to, okay, like so and so cultural kind of their cultural identity, but there's also like people are also individuals, and may like, you know, somebody who's exactly the same, you know, person as me could react really differently, and it's important to have some space of understanding that. But I think also like in those spaces, in those kind of solidarity, like spaces where you can build solidarity, you can say, like name the things that you can find that you know, feel like off about the sector, that often then you internalize. And I think I'm not, you know, I don't work in mental health, but this idea of like a moral injury, I think is like relevant here, you know, that if you're like looking at, you know, you're like working in a space and you're like, this feels so unfair and I'm somehow participating in this, but I have to keep doing it. I think having that kind of space, like a brave space where you can name that and in a safe way, I think can also ease some of that kind of burden, you know. Yeah, and then I mean, just like I think any conversation on well-being, I mean, without like naming Audre Lorde, I think somehow like it's inevitable. But I think this idea also of like, you don't use the same kind of tools of like shaming or a carceral kind of approach of like, oh, you're just terrible. You know, you don't use those tools to break down that house of, you know. So yeah, just I think just creating space to be caring. But yeah, thanks.
And I also hear via you almost repeating some of the things that Hidden has said about sort of the burden sharing. Hidden, you were talking about it on a structural level, but even within an organization potentially, that it's not just your manager or your boss who is in charge of caring for you, but maybe there's a way within an organization to share that burden, to create those brave spaces. And then that is reflected in the larger perspective of the organizations sharing the burdens among each other. You guys all have some really amazing ideas, and I hope these things are actually being implemented and these changes are happening. It's really encouraging to hear people thinking and outside the box about how to bring well-being into the structures of the organizations that we work in. So that sort of leads us to our third question. How can the professional culture of the humanitarian sector around staff well-being be improved? So I think you guys kind of touched on some of these things, but maybe we can explore this a little bit further.
I just wanted to pick up something, you know, Ria, you were saying as well. It sometimes depends on your boss, and absolutely, I remember on 3 distinct occasions in organizations, mostly in the in the UK, the UK-based organizations, and we were looking at the well-being culture within the organizations and the mindset within the organization, and in these 3 organizations, what was anomalous about why they suddenly prioritized well-being and mental health was simply because their chief executives personally went through their own burnout, depression, anxiety, downtime, whatever it was. And it was only that intimate, innate sort of relationship with their own depression or their anxiety or their burnout, whatever they went through, which actually led them to understand, oh, this is really important. And it was that sort of led to this reconsidered, reprioritization of why mental health should be at the top of the list for everybody. And so I get that. And there was a conversation I was just literally having a couple of days ago. So for the university, we're developing another course, and one of them is, it's one of these sort of arty-farty sort of terms, about the politics of resilience. I said, well, what's all this politics of resilience? And well, very simply, there is still sometimes when you've got a gung-ho manager who feels that your responsibility for being resilient is upon you, and that responsibility is not really the organization. And if something doesn't work out, you were not resilient enough, for example, that's the very sort of cynical point of view. And then there's this idea then, well, okay, where is the politics? Where does the power of well-being and resilience in an organization lie? And obviously it's a balance. We're all responsible for our personal approach to how the stress is affecting us, but we also need to be supported, it's sort of a circle within a circle, a cog within a cog. We also need to have a fully live, living, breathing, operational well-being structure within the organization, so that if something does happen, you've got that as a way to support you and to help you as well. For me, marrying the two, the politics of resilience and making sure that well-being is there, something that Sophie, you touched upon as well, this idea of self-awareness. You talked about your sort of, was it the learning circles or the discussion circles? Gemma knows this, from the work that I've been doing with mindfulness. A lot of the work that I'm doing now is on mindful self-awareness. To balance out, you need not only individual self-awareness, but a level of organizational self-awareness as well. And you can only cultivate that by cultivating many people to have individual self-awareness within organizations, especially the nodes of influence, which are your managers, your leaders, etc. And so one way of changing how well-being can be improved within organizations is, obviously we don't want all of our leaders to have breakdowns and have their stressful moments, and for them to suddenly recognize it and realize it and incorporate it within organizations. But one of the most amazing sort of Trojan horses here is if you suddenly say to one of your bosses, your leaders, hey, there's a way of you becoming much more better as a leader, you can make better decisions, you can be much more able to manage and self-manage yourself. And when you talk about self-awareness, mindful self-awareness and leadership, it automatically includes well-being as well, because you start getting in touch with yourself. And one way of approaching change for well-being in organizations is to focus on senior management and their impact of leadership change through self-awareness. So self-managing yourself can help you become a better manager to lead other people. And part of that leading is to make sure you're looking after your well-being and the well-being of others, because ultimately the impact that you want to make will only be improved if everyone operating optimally as a result of that. And so marrying all those pieces together, I think that's a way of improving staff well-being by increasing self-awareness within organizations. And the work that I've been doing on mindfulness is now moving more and more into organizational mindfulness as well. So that, I think that's a way of seeding self-awareness in organizations and essentially creating an organizational soul, as it were, to the best you can.
I like that almost personification of organizations, because I think, as we all know, they tend to become their own being, regardless of whether they are or are not healthy, and creating that like organizational personification of a healthy, well, resilient organization, I think is a really helpful perspective to better wrapping our minds around that.
Anyway, that's my topics left.
Does anyone else have an answer to the professional culture, how to change the professional culture around staff well-being?
I'd just like to continue what Hiten was saying around senior leadership teams. And I think especially in smaller charities, I think that is where probably the biggest shift can happen. What we find quite often is that, you know, volunteers who stay, let's say in Greece for a prolonged period of time, they move up into coordinator positions and eventually into senior leadership positions, meaning they have been working in that setting for a prolonged period of time with very little support, meaning they're also showing certain levels of burnout. And that is then when new volunteers come into that environment that is already slightly poisoned with burnout, and that is coming from leadership positions. And we all don't really, you know, we all look up to people, and we want role models, and especially when you're new in that setting, you want to identify with the people who are working above you. And then having, you know, a leader that is potentially glorifying burnout and talking about how, you know, haven't had a holiday in months, or we have been working crazy hours every single week, it's quite easy to slip into that pattern, and also being on that train of glorifying that burnout. So I think that is probably where one of the biggest shifts could happen, and that's how you could essentially, yeah, improve the organizational culture. But organizational cultures, as I have seen it, has usually always been driven from top down rather than bottom up, and a bottom up approach usually is not very welcome, because you've got like the oldies and the newbies dynamic there, I think.
Yeah, that's a really important thing to get the senior leadership into doing it. For organizations that I think are like more entrenched, like they're older organizations that senior leadership has been there a long time, how do you kind of start that conversation with senior leadership when they might not necessarily have developed that, or that's not the organization they were raised in?
I think, again, it goes back to sharing these experiences. I think what I have seen is that quite a lot of people in these leadership positions are quite isolated, because they don't feel like they can, you know, go to their own team necessarily to discuss, you know, what they might be going through themselves. And part of the humanitarian wellbeing pilot that we are currently running is bringing together the senior leadership teams from different organizations, so they have a safe space to talk about the challenges that they might be facing. So that's how we are trying to sort of navigate that at the moment.
Nice, thank you. Ria and Gemma, do you guys have anything you want to build off of, or an answer to the question of how to change professional culture for staff well-being?
I'd just like to echo some of what's already been said, and just build on that a bit. I think, well, two things. I think, as Hitam was saying, that the self-awareness is so important. We need that space to pause and to reflect, and certainly kind of mindfulness and embodied practice is a central part of that. And again, it's something I talk about a lot in my book. You know, how do we come back into the body and feel what's going on, but also really kind of pause to become more aware of who we are in this ecosystem of aid, because, you know, there are power dynamics at play there, and we need to, part of our self-awareness is about understanding those power dynamics, how we feed into it, but also how we can play a better role, how we can challenge some of the sort of more unhealthy behaviors. And this isn't just about the power dynamics of global north, global south, or to do with race or gender. It is also the power dynamics of leaders or managers and staff. And so one of the things that I talk about in the book in terms of changing culture is trying to break down hierarchies, so that we can be more inclusive in the way that we work together, so that there isn't so much of this sort of top-down, you know, the managers at the top have all the answers, because actually that's often not true. The managers at the top often don't have the answers. They don't. How do they know? They're not necessarily in the field seeing what's going on day to day. You know, it is often staff in the field that are going to know these things, or younger people who are coming in with new ideas. Like, how can we bring that in so that we're bringing something fresh, that's coming from different people, and respecting that everyone has something to contribute in that way. So I think all of that is certainly important, and really important when we are looking to kind of decolonize and localize our approaches as well. That does mean not relying on what head office is saying, and then trying to challenge that where we can. Another area I would say is just in terms of, how do we create those spaces around embodiment or mindfulness practice? What I talk about a lot is bringing ritual or bringing play into the workplace. And, people get very scared by this word ritual and sort of think it's very woo-woo or new agey or whatever. But it is just about, bringing in something that's not about, it's encouraging you to remove your professional mask. So, because we are all human beings behind the work that we do, and we have our hopes and desires and our flaws and our silliness and our mistakes and everything else. We all do. And how can we kind of bring that in? And there's all sorts of different ways, and certainly perhaps mindfulness practice is one of them. Dance is another. I know some organizations where they have a playlist and they dance at the end of the week together on Zoom. Which is another area, of course, when we're talking about changing the culture or what needs to change, we have to recognize that right now, the way we work is really different from how it was 2 years ago. And we need to offer support to that and recognize that it's really hard for some people working from home all the time. Their homes are not necessarily a safe place. And it might also be really hard for national staff at the moment who are being depended on far more than they were before. Although there are good things to that as well, possibly. So a whole other discussion. But, how can we just create a space where we can have a breather and perhaps have some fun or just be vulnerable? And that needn't cost the earth. It's just about bringing in certain things throughout the working day that recognize our humanness and our need to be human together.
Yeah, that's really great. I like the humanness and the vulnerability, and even actually the invitation for play and ritual. I think about like transitions and how transitions really invite the need for the grieving process and to develop those rituals. And I think in the humanitarian aid sector, you see transitions often, all the time, because it changes rapidly. And so how do you integrate that into the work and the way that you interact as an organizational culture? That's really, really awesome. I really look forward to your book, Gemma. This sounds great. Ria, do you have any responses to this question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking I really like all of the ideas everybody's had, especially about this idea of like, how do you bring play or even like joy or, into your work? And I think, and as you see it, like, when I moved back to India after I did this study, basically, and I just like used like the study that we did, which is it's not very like deep work, but it's an interesting kind of saying, okay, look, these are the things on the table. But I used it as a kind of pivot to talk to a lot of people who normally wouldn't want to talk about well-being, and take it to some spaces just for more information. And something I heard from somebody who works in the refugee context in India was how hard it can feel how hard it is to feel like you have a win, right? Because like there is just no space for that. Like there is it just doesn't exist, And this person was saying, but what he saw, like working with an organization in Kashmir, like which is like under a lot of stress, at a daily level, they had this way of celebrating like smaller wins, of like really like bringing the joy into like, well, we haven't changed like the larger like really like difficult context we work in, but there is a way to sort of bring that sense of like joy and even play maybe, but into the meat of the work that you're doing. I think that's really important. And I think like at a really important part of the professional culture is like really like reassessing what productivity means, and really like having like, I know when I've worked in an organization where somebody has said, look, we know it's hard to say no, you have to learn how to say no, and it's okay. People have to learn to not get insulted when you say no, I can't do this. That means everything, it really does, versus like, other contexts where you work with somebody who's like, yeah, of course you have to be busy. Everybody has to be. I'd be worried if you weren't busy or something like that, but just like, I don't know how to do it. Like what makes, whether it's like somebody going through like their own sense of burnout, which I hope it doesn't have to be that, to get to this sense of like, you have to be able to say like, I can be productive, but that doesn't mean I'm like working 15 hours and burnt out and tired all the time. But so that's my sort of 2 cents on, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really challenging to own that and create those boundaries for yourself in a culture where everyone else doesn't want to do that, or they're having a hard time doing that themselves. So we've kind of gotten through our 3 questions. You guys have given awesome, wonderful, thoughtful answers. I just feel so much stoke and excitement about everything we've been talking about. This makes me feel really alive. We have a couple of attendees. I just want to give them the opportunity, if anyone has any questions that they want for the panelists, feel free to put those into the chat. I actually have one question from some of the things we've talked about that came up to me. We were talking about, like, in a culture of humanitarian aid that seems to be so often driven by donor relationships, how do we practice well-being in a donor relationship context?
This is something that was, working sort of operationally day to day, especially with Action Against Hunger as partnerships and programs manager. It was constantly trying to get the next funding for the next project, and competing with your colleagues and other agencies for finite pots of money. And one of the emphasis is, one of the emphasis areas for me was always to put down something on well-being. And I still think that donors are missing a trick. I don't know if things have changed in the last couple of years, but if donors can understand that the very impact that they want to make with taxpayer money, for example, if they're a government donor or even a private funder, the impact that they want to make with the project and the lives of the people that they're supporting will be far more better if the well-being of the staff delivering the project is included. Because you could have a short-term game with one project where everyone does everything within 3 months to do whatever they need to do, but they'll be burned out that in the second project, the third project, all the energy, the motivation, the will to live is going to go. But if they can fund part of that, the funding, if they can have a line in it for that well-being to really seed the idea, it's not just the money, but it's the influence that the donor has on the agencies, the entire sector, but ultimately on the beneficiaries themselves. The impact will be far more greater on them if there's an element of well-being and people are looked after. Because that interface between the aid worker and the beneficiary is where that real humanity, that work of humanity, the work of humanitarianism is, that interface is important. And I think if the donors can really catch that, that'd be useful. Sadly, it means that real politics are involved, because we know that DIF is now been disbanded, for example, and it's not part of the Commonwealth Office, and we know that most funding has some sort of agenda behind it. But if we can put a real humanitarian agenda behind the funding, a real human agenda behind the funding, and they can realize that the impact of that money will be far better for them, even for whatever side vested interest they have, it will actually be better in the long run for everyone. So step by step, changing that mindset is part of the key for that.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any thoughts on donor relations and well-being?
I guess I would come at it sort of from a slightly different angle, which would be, how can we look at donors as human beings as well? Because I think what I've found, certainly in my own experience working different organisations, but sort of, when I'm asking people about this very important question that you're posing, there's this sort of assumption of, the donors are almost sort of untouchable. They're this elite that have, you know, they're bureaucrats or technocrats, I mean, which they are in some ways, but they are also human beings, and many of them themselves are going through very similar problems, you know, in terms of the pressure of the work, in terms of burnout, all of these sorts of problems. And, you know, is there a way to have that conversation to recognize that this is not just a problem that their partner organizations have or the organizations they're funding have, but it's a problem within their system too. And I just wonder if that's a route in to really highlight the importance of this, as Hiten's saying, in terms of the actual impact that it has, not just on the work being done, but perhaps on their staff as well. And how do we do that? You know, I think, you know, that we have to start having different conversations with donors that are less about just sort of getting a particular output or report or whatever it is done, but trying to build trust and build a relationship where those sorts of conversations can happen. And I'm not saying that's easy, but I think, you know, we sometimes make assumptions that we perhaps need to challenge our assumptions about how we actually communicate with donors in the first place, so that we can perhaps start opening up that conversation.
Yeah, like a real invitation to vulnerability for everybody involved, and almost as if it's not just the humanitarian aid sector that has issues with well-being, it's actually just our societal structure in general, and humanitarian structure is just a reflection of that.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Sounds like hard work, but good work. Well, wonderful. Does anyone else have anything to add? And if not, that's okay. No?
I'm interested, who's joined us? Are they able to reveal themselves and introduce themselves a little bit? It'd be great to see what backgrounds they're from, and like
Sure.
magic, they've appeared.
Yeah, well, so we have two attendees. They aren't allowed to talk usually, but I just gave talking permission. So attendees, if you would like to talk and add anything, feel free. If not, that's okay. We can also...
In the spirit of humanity, please talk.
I don't even know.
Perhaps we have got shy people on board today.
So I'm one of the people watching. I don't really have anything to contribute to this. It's something that interests me hugely, but that I don't have experience of working in the sector. But I wanted to say how much I very much enjoyed hearing all of you speak. So thank you very much. Thank you, Cassie. Cassie, what do you do? And or why are you interested in kind of this conversation? I guess I'm interested. I'm a teacher, so I work with teenagers and young people, and in this country, and I work in pastoral care. So I work with trauma and issues within this country with young people, and I guess I'm interested because there are refugees in my family background, and I've seen kind of the resulting trauma that results from people and which carries on into future generations unless we can work with it adequately. So it's something that's close to my heart and of very great interest to me. I'd like to thank you for the insights that you've given us today. Thank you for sharing, Cassie. We really appreciate that and appreciate you attending and listening. Thank you. I think there are a lot of other people who watch it later, actually, on the recording. Yeah, I will say a lot of people tend to watch webinars post-webinar posting. Yeah, so. Yeah. Well, I just want to thank all the panelists. Thank you so much for coming, for sharing your experience. I think you guys are all doing really good work. Our other attendee says thank you as well. I think you guys are doing all really good work. These are conversations that I think need to happen, not just in the humanitarian sector, not just in the development sector, but in society in general. And I feel really encouraged that people are devoting their lives and their energy to this kind of work and focusing on it. And I
hope that the work you guys do just continues to expand and ripple out and affect more and more communities. And hopefully we can create a healthier human society, living Earth experience for all of us. So thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the listeners. And we'll stop here.
Thanks for the invite. So I hope that's added some value.